I still remember the day I met her, Kelly. She was standing in the courtyard of our university, her hair catching the late autumn sunlight, a carefree smile playing on her lips. She was talking to a friend, but even in that moment, surrounded by others, she seemed alone, as if she existed in a world that was uniquely her own. It's funny how moments like that stick with you, how you can look back and remember every little detail of when your life started to change, even if you had no idea at the time. I was shy back then, the type who blended into the background, more comfortable with my books than with people. But there was something about Kelly that drew me in. Maybe it was the way she laughed, or how she seemed genuinely interested in the world around her. Whatever it was, I found myself drawn to her in a way I hadn't been to anyone before. It didn't take long before we started talking, and from there, everything moved fast. One moment we were strangers, and the next we were spending every free moment together, staying up late in each other's dorm rooms, discussing our dreams, our fears, our plans for the future. We clicked in a way that felt natural, like two puzzle pieces fitting together perfectly. We had our fights, sure. What couple doesn't? But even in those early days, there was something about Kelly that made me feel like everything was going to be okay. I could be myself around her, with all my insecurities and flaws, and she accepted me for it. Or at least, that's what I thought. We married 2 years after graduation. I was working at a small marketing firm, slowly climbing the corporate ladder, while Kelly was starting her own photography business. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, and we were happy, so I thought. We got a small house in the suburbs, nothing fancy, just enough for the two of us and the future we had planned together. Kids, travel, success, it all seemed so close, just waiting for us to reach out and grab it. But as the years went by, things started to change. The subtle shifts that happen when two people stop communicating, stop really seeing each other. I was working longer hours, trying to make partner, and Kelly's business was taking off in ways neither of us had expected. We started spending more time apart, living parallel lives, rather than the intertwined one we'd had at the beginning. And that's where the cracks began to show. I should have noticed sooner. The way Kelly became more distant, her smile no longer reaching her eyes when she looked at me. But I didn't. I was too wrapped up in my own world, too focused on my career and what I thought was our shared future. And by the time I did notice, it was too late. There's always that one moment when everything changes. For me, it was a Tuesday evening. I had come home late from the office, exhausted, ready to collapse on the couch and unwind. But when I walked in, the house was quiet, too quiet. Kelly wasn't home, which wasn't unusual, but there was something different that night, something in the air. I brushed it off, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid, that she was probably out with friends or on a late photo shoot. But then I saw it. Her phone, left on the kitchen counter, buzzing with messages from a name I didn't recognize. I should have walked away. I should have trusted her, but I didn't. I picked up the phone, opened the messages, and everything came crashing down. That night, I read through every single message. I couldn't stop myself, even as each new text revealed a truth that shattered my world a little more. There it was, laid out in cold, cruel words. Proof that the life I thought we were living was a lie. Kelly was seeing someone else. The messages were full of intimacy and affection, things she hadn't shared with me in months, maybe even longer. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I scrolled through the conversations. The man's name was Mark. He wasn't some random fling. They had a connection, a history. Their messages spoke of shared moments, secret meetings, and plans for the future, things that should have been ours. I could feel my heart racing, my palms sweating as I tried to understand how this had happened, how we had ended up here. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I sat in the dark, staring at my hands, trying to piece together how I had been so blind. I had always thought our marriage was strong, that no matter how much life threw at us, we would weather it together. But I had been wrong, so very wrong. The next few days passed in a haze. I went to work, did what was expected of me, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time I looked at Kelly, all I could see were the lies, the betrayal, and it made me sick. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. I wanted to know more, needed to know more. I had to be sure before I confronted her. I started keeping tabs on her, checking her phone, watching her movements, trying to catch her in the act. I became obsessed with uncovering the full extent of her deceit, and the more I dug, the worse it got. She wasn't just cheating on me with Mark. She had been lying to me for months, telling me she was working late or spending time with friends when she was really with him. And I had believed her every single time. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. One evening, when she came home after another photo shoot, I sat her down in the living room. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands shaking as I held her phone in my hand, the messages open for her to see. "Who is Mark?" I asked, my voice cold and flat. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. The color drained from her face, her eyes widening in shock and fear. For a moment, she was speechless, her lips parting as if to form some kind of excuse, but no words came out. She knew. She knew she had been caught. I can explain," she stammered, but I didn't want to hear it. "Explain what?" I snapped, throwing the phone onto the couch between us. "Explain how you've been lying to me for months, how you've been sneaking around behind my back with another man. What is there to explain, Kelly?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. Not now, not after everything I had seen. She tried to reach out to me, but I pulled away, standing up and pacing the room like a caged animal. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice trembling. It just happened." "That's not an explanation," I shot back, my voice rising with anger. "That's an excuse. You didn't mean for it to happen? You didn't mean to betray me?" She wiped at her eyes, but the tears kept coming. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly. "You did. You destroyed everything." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, suffocating, as if the weight of our entire relationship was pressing down on us, crushing us both. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to make her feel the pain I was feeling. But instead, I just stood there, my hands clenched into fists, my entire body shaking with rage and hurt. "Why?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you do it?" She didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I don't know," she said at last. "I was lonely. You were always working, always busy with your career, and I felt like you didn't see me anymore." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been busy, it was true. I had been working late, trying to build a future for us. But was that really an excuse for what she had done? Did my absence justify her betrayal? "I was doing it for us," I said, my voice breaking. "I was working hard because I wanted to give us a better life. I wanted to make things easier for you, for us. And this is how you repay me?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." But sorry wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. Our marriage was over, and in that moment, I knew it. I could feel the finality of it, like a door slamming shut between us, locking us on opposite sides. "I want you to leave," I said quietly, turning away from her. "I can't do this anymore." She sobbed, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. The woman I had loved, the woman I had married, was gone. In her place was someone I no longer recognized, someone who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. As I listened to her gather her things and walk out the door, I felt nothing but a cold, empty void where my heart had once been. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone in the house that we had once shared. The silence that followed was deafening. It pressed down on me, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, my mind racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. She was gone. My wife, the woman I had vowed to love, honor, and cherish, had walked out, and I had told her to leave. I should have felt relief, or maybe even satisfaction, but all I felt was empty. Hollow. I sat down on the couch, burying my face in my hands. My chest tightened as the reality of the situation settled in. This wasn't a bad dream I could wake up from. This was real, and there was no escaping it. Kelly had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of our broken life. I thought back to when we had first moved into this house. We had been so full of hope, so sure that we were building a future together. We had spent hours talking about our dreams, our plans, everything we wanted from life. Now, all of that was gone, shattered like glass. I walked through the house, looking at the reminders of the life we had built together. The framed photos on the walls, the souvenirs from trips we had taken, the little notes she used to leave for me on the fridge. All of it felt like a lie now, tainted by what she had done. Each memory, once sweet, now stung like salt on an open wound. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was her with him, Mark. My imagination ran wild, filling in the blanks, showing me things I didn't want to see, but couldn't stop thinking about. The pain was unbearable. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to find any relief from the thoughts swirling in my head. The next few days passed in a blur. I went to work, went through the motions, but I was on autopilot. My coworkers noticed that something was wrong, but no one said anything. I wasn't sure if I was grateful for their silence or if I resented them for pretending everything was fine. Inside, I was falling apart, but on the outside, I had to keep it together. And then, one night, it hit me. Why should Kelly be the only one to face consequences? Why should I be the one left to suffer while she went on with her life, pretending nothing had happened? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. She had destroyed my life, my trust, my happiness, and now she would pay. I knew I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't just walk away from the wreckage of our marriage without doing something, without making her feel the same pain she had inflicted on me. I didn't care if it was wrong. I didn't care if it made me the villain in this story. All I cared about was making her hurt the way I was hurting. That's when I came up with the plan. It started small, an idea, really. But the more I thought about it, the more it consumed me. I was going to expose her. I was going to make sure everyone knew what she had done. I would make her feel the shame, the humiliation that I had felt when I found out she was with another man. She deserved it. She deserved every ounce of misery I could give her. I began collecting evidence. I went through her phone again, taking screenshots of the messages between her and Mark. I even found photos she had taken with him. Each image, each word was like a knife twisting deeper into the wound, but I kept going. I had to. I needed everything if I was going to ruin her. It wasn't enough just to confront her. No, this needed to be public. People needed to see the real Kelly, the one who lied and cheated, the one who pretended to be perfect while destroying everything around her. I created a folder on my computer and titled it, The Truth. Inside, I placed every message, every photo, every shred of evidence that proved her betrayal. And then I did the unthinkable. I posted it all online. I didn't use my name, of course. I created a fake account, anonymous enough that it couldn't be traced back to me. I made sure the post was shared in all the right places, social media, forums, even the websites Kelly frequented. And then I waited. It didn't take long for the firestorm to begin. People reacted exactly as I had hoped. Outrage, disgust, shock. It was all there, playing out in real time as strangers condemned Kelly for what she had done. Her name was everywhere, attached to the scandal I had unleashed. People called her all sorts of names, some of them too vile to repeat. They were angry, and I reveled in their anger. She lost everything. Her business, her pride and joy, crumbled overnight. Clients canceled contracts, her reputation was in tatters, and she became a pariah in the professional world she had worked so hard to build. She had no choice but to leave, to disappear. But I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected. As I watched her life unravel, something inside me shifted. The anger that had driven me, that had fueled my need for revenge, began to fade. In its place was something darker, something emptier. I had done what I set out to do. I had ruined her, just as she had ruined me. But instead of feeling victorious, I felt nothing. I had burned her world to the ground, but in doing so, I had destroyed something inside myself as well. The days that followed were a blur. I thought the act of revenge would somehow cleanse the rage from my heart, wash away the bitterness that had consumed me. But instead, I found myself staring at the screen, refreshing the pages where Kelly's scandal spread like wildfire, watching the comments pour in. The venom in their words was overwhelming. Strangers, people who had never met her, ripped her apart without mercy. At first, I had joined in, feeding the flames of the narrative I had created. It was a strange kind of catharsis, like venting a wound and hoping the poison would finally drain. But with each passing day, something changed. What I had once seen as validation for my pain began to feel like a hollow victory. Each click, each comment seemed to echo back to me, a reminder that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Kelly disappeared almost immediately after the story broke. She didn't try to reach out, didn't call or text. She just vanished. Her social media accounts went dark, her business's website closed, and her photography studio shuttered. Word spread quickly in the small circles we had shared. People talked, whispered behind closed doors about what had happened, about how a seemingly perfect marriage had exploded so violently in public. And I couldn't escape it. No matter how hard I tried, I'd see her face in old photos that popped up in my newsfeed, reminding me of the life we once had, the smiles that now seemed so distant, so fake. I had loved her, truly loved her. And now, in the ashes of everything we had built together, I couldn't even recognize the man I had become. I wasn't proud of what I had done. I couldn't look in the mirror without seeing the reflection of a man driven by hate, a man who had chosen revenge over healing. There was no going back. I had ruined her, but in doing so, I had ruined myself. It wasn't long before my own life started to unravel. My friends, our friends, began to drift away. I guess they didn't know what to say, didn't know how to deal with the man who had become a walking embodiment of anger and resentment. At first, they had been sympathetic. Everyone had known something was off between Kelly and me, but no one had expected things to end like this. Once the dust settled, they started keeping their distance. The phone calls stopped, the invitations to hang out dried up. I was alone, just like I had made Kelly. And the worst part? I didn't care. In some twisted way, I had convinced myself that this isolation was justified, that I was the victim, the one who had been wronged. I didn't need anyone's pity or their judgment. I had done what I had to do. I had exposed the truth, and in the process, I had lost everything. But that was the price of betrayal, wasn't it? Or so I thought. It wasn't until weeks later, when the adrenaline of revenge finally began to wear off, that I started to feel the weight of my actions. The house was unbearably quiet. The rooms echoed with memories of a life that no longer existed. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. Every corner of our home reminded me of her, of us, and of the irrevocable damage I had caused. I had destroyed the person I once loved. And for what? What had I really gained? The satisfaction had been fleeting, and now all that remained was a deep, gnawing emptiness. One night, I found myself scrolling through old photos, a glass of whiskey in my hand. My vision blurred as I stared at the images of us, of Kelly and me, smiling, happy, full of hope for the future. There was one picture in particular that caught my eye. It was from our honeymoon, taken on the beach at sunset. I remembered that day so clearly. We had spent hours walking along the shore, talking about the life we were going to build together. I threw the phone down, unable to look at it any longer. My chest tightened, and I felt the familiar sting of tears in my eyes. I hadn't cried since the day I found out about the affair. I hadn't allowed myself to. But now, the dam broke, and the flood of emotions I had been holding back for so long came rushing out. I had loved her, despite everything. Despite the lies, the betrayal, the heartbreak, I had loved her. And maybe in some twisted way, I still did. But that didn't change what had happened. It didn't change the fact that I had destroyed her life out of spite, out of anger. And it didn't change the fact that now I was left with nothing. I thought about calling her, reaching out, apologizing for what I had done. But what would be the point? The damage was done. Kelly had moved on, or at least she was trying to. And I had to face the reality that no apology, no amount of regret could undo what I had done. The weight of it all pressed down on me, suffocating. I had become the very thing I had hated. In my quest for revenge, I had turned into someone I didn't even recognize, and now I was paying the price. Time has a strange way of slowing down when you're alone. The days blurred together, one indistinguishable from the next, marked only by the growing emptiness that consumed me. I thought I could escape it, that the satisfaction of ruining Kelly would somehow fill the void she had left behind. But that wasn't how it worked. Instead of feeling victorious, I felt hollow. My routine had become depressingly predictable. Wake up, work, come home to an empty house, drink, sleep, repeat. I was barely living, more like existing in the aftermath of a storm I had unleashed. I had lost everything. My marriage, my friends, even my sense of self. It was as though I had traded my soul for revenge, only to discover that it wasn't worth the price. One evening, I sat in the dim light of my living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table in front of me. The TV was on, but I wasn't really watching. It was just background noise, something to drown out the silence that had become my constant companion. I glanced at my phone, tempted to look at the aftermath of Kelly's life, to see if she had resurfaced anywhere. I resisted, though. I knew it wouldn't help. I was deep in my thoughts when a knock on the door startled me. It was late, too late for anyone to be stopping by unannounced. My heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, I wondered if it could be Kelly. But that was impossible. She wouldn't come here. Not after everything that had happened. I opened the door cautiously, and there she was. Kelly. She stood on my doorstep, her face pale and gaunt, a far cry from the confident, vibrant woman I had once loved. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore a look of defeat that matched the way I had been feeling for weeks. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension between us was thick, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. I hadn't seen her since the day she walked out, hadn't heard a word from her since I destroyed her life. And now, here she was, standing in front of me, as though no time had passed at all. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, my mind racing. Every instinct told me to slam the door in her face, to shut her out just like I had done when I posted those messages online. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, so different from the last time I'd seen her. She looked broken, like me. I stepped aside, letting her in. She walked into the living room, her eyes scanning the space as though she was trying to make sense of it all, of me. I watched her closely, unsure of what to say, unsure of why she was even here. Finally, she sat down on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. I stayed standing, unsure if I could trust myself to sit down beside her. "I'm sorry," she said after a long silence, her voice trembling. "For everything." I didn't know what to say. I had spent so much time hating her, so much time blaming her for everything that had gone wrong, that hearing her apologize now didn't feel real. I had built up this narrative in my head, that she was the villain and I was the victim. But seeing her like this, so vulnerable, made me question everything. "I'm sorry too," I finally said, surprising myself with the admission, "for what I did to you." She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with tears. "You had every right to be angry," she said softly. "What I did, it was unforgivable. I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to explain, and I hate myself for it." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that her regret was genuine, that she was truly sorry for everything that had happened. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. We were beyond repair, weren't we? "What you did, it destroyed me," I said, my voice hoarse. "I loved you, Kelly. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for him." She flinched at the mention of Mark, the man who had come between us. Her hands shook as she wiped at her eyes, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill over. "I know," she whispered. "And I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you like that. I was lost." I let out a bitter laugh. "Lost? That's your excuse?" "No," she said quickly. "It's not an excuse. It's just the truth. I didn't know who I was anymore. I felt invisible, like you didn't see me. And Mark, he made me feel seen." Her words stung, but I understood them more than I wanted to admit. We had both been lost, both been drowning in a life that had spiraled out of control. But that didn't make what she did right. It didn't erase the pain she had caused. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice rising. "What about what I did to you? I ruined your life, Kelly. I exposed everything. I destroyed you." She looked at me, and to my surprise, she nodded. "You did," she said softly, "but I deserved it." Her admission hit me like a punch to the gut. I had expected her to be angry, to hate me for what I had done. But instead, she accepted it. She accepted that she had deserved the pain I had caused, and that made it all the worse. "I lost everything," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "My job, my friends, my reputation. But the worst part is that I lost you." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she had no right to miss me after what she had done. But another part of me, deep down, understood. Despite everything, we had shared a life together. We had loved each other once, and that kind of love didn't just disappear. "I can't go back," I said quietly, more to myself than to her. She nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I know. I don't expect you to. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the weight of everything we had been through pressing down on us. I could feel the anger starting to fade, replaced by something else, something I couldn't quite define. Maybe it was acceptance, or maybe it was just exhaustion. "I'm sorry," I said again, and this time I meant it. She smiled sadly. "So am I." And then she stood, walking to the door without another word. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it. As the door clicked shut behind her, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss. But this time, it wasn't the sharp, bitter pain of betrayal. It was something quieter, something deeper. Revenge had cost me everything. And in the end, it hadn't been worth it. The days following Kelly's visit felt like the aftermath of a great storm. Everything was eerily quiet, but the damage was unmistakable. Her words lingered in my mind, replaying over and over until they became a dull, constant ache that I couldn't shake. "I lost you." Those 3 simple words felt heavier than anything else she'd said that night. And even though I had sworn to myself that there was no going back, that we were beyond repair, a part of me wondered if I had lost her too. Life went on, but it was different now. The anger that had once driven me, the fury that had fueled my every move, was gone. In its place was a deep, hollow emptiness that I couldn't fill, no matter how hard I tried. I had achieved my goal. I had gotten my revenge. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt more alone than ever. I went back to work, but my heart wasn't in it. The long hours that I had once thrown myself into now felt meaningless. The promotions, the career goals, none of it mattered anymore. My coworkers still kept their distance, though I couldn't blame them. I had become a ghost of myself, moving through the motions of life without any real purpose. One afternoon, a few weeks after Kelly's visit, I found myself at a bar, one of those small, dimly lit places where you go to disappear for a while. I hadn't intended to drink that much, but before I knew it, I was 3 beers deep, staring blankly at the condensation on my glass. The buzz from the alcohol barely took the edge off, but at least it was something. That's when I saw her. Kelly. She was sitting alone at the far end of the bar, nursing a drink and staring out the window. I hadn't expected to run into her again, not after the way we had left things, and for a moment, I considered leaving. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the sadness in her posture, or maybe it was the fact that I had been feeling that same sadness ever since she walked out of my house that night. I watched her for a while, debating whether or not to approach her. She looked different now, thinner, quieter, as though the weight of everything that had happened had worn her down. And I realized that this wasn't the Kelly I had married. The woman sitting in front of me wasn't the confident, lively person I had once loved. She was someone else, someone broken, just like me. Without really thinking, I got up and walked over to her. She didn't notice me at first, too lost in her thoughts to see me standing there. But when she finally looked up, her eyes widened in surprise. "Hey," I said awkwardly, not really sure what else to say. "Hey," she replied softly, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the bar. I motioned to the seat beside her. "Mind if I sit?" She hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "Sure." We sat in silence for a while, neither of us knowing how to start the conversation. It felt surreal, being here with her again, as if we had somehow been transported back in time to when things were simpler, before everything had fallen apart. "I didn't expect to see you here," I finally said, breaking the silence. Kelly let out a small, humorless laugh. "Yeah, me neither." We both stared down at our drinks. The unspoken tension between us thick in the air. I could feel the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging over us, but I didn't know how to start. "How have you been?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She shrugged. "I've been better." "Same." Another long silence followed, and I could feel the frustration building inside me. I didn't want to keep dancing around the truth, pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. There was too much history between us, too much pain. "I don't know why I did it," I blurted out, the words tumbling from my mouth before I could stop them. "The revenge, I mean. I thought it would make things better, but it didn't. It just made everything worse." Kelly looked at me, her eyes filled with sadness. "I know," she said quietly. "I've thought about that night so many times, about what I did and what you did, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. We were both hurting. We were both lost." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I hurt you, Kelly. I hurt you more than I ever thought I could, and I can't take that back." She reached out and touched my hand, a small gesture, but one that sent a wave of emotion crashing over me. "I hurt you too," she whispered. "And I'm sorry for everything." We sat there, holding on to that moment, both of us too exhausted to keep fighting. The anger, the betrayal, it was still there, but it had dulled over time, worn away by the months of separation and regret. And in that moment, I realized that maybe we had both been searching for the same thing all along. Not revenge, not victory, but closure. "I can't undo what I did," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want to hate you anymore." Kelly nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't want to hate you either." We didn't talk much after that. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden moment of clarity where everything was forgiven. But for the first time in a long time, there was peace between us. A fragile, tentative peace, but peace nonetheless. As the evening wore on, we finished our drinks and said our goodbyes. She left first, and I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. This wasn't a happy ending, but maybe it didn't have to be. Maybe it was enough that we had both survived the storm, that we had both come out the other side. I walked home that night, the cool air clearing my head. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The bitterness that had consumed me for so long was still there, but it wasn't as sharp anymore. It had softened, dulled by time and regret. Revenge had cost me more than I ever could have imagined. But now, as I stood alone in the quiet of the night, I realized that maybe it was time to stop looking back. To stop trying to punish Kelly for the pain we had caused each other. Maybe it was time to forgive. In the months that followed my unexpected reunion with Kelly, life began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The anger that had once fueled me had dissipated, leaving behind a strange sense of emptiness. It wasn't the clean slate I had imagined when I first sought revenge. It was more like a desolate wasteland where nothing had grown in the ashes of what I had destroyed. I went through the motions of everyday life, but everything felt muted, as if I was living behind a thick glass wall, watching the world but never fully engaging with it. Work became mechanical, a series of tasks to be completed without thought or emotion. My colleagues had stopped inviting me to after-work drinks or social events. In fact, they barely spoke to me at all, which suited me just fine. I had learned to live with the isolation, even embraced it at times. It was easier than confronting the mess I had made of my life. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of Kelly on social media. Though she had largely stayed off the grid, a friend of a friend might post a photo of her at some event or mention her in passing. She was still in the process of rebuilding her life, trying to put back the pieces that I had shattered. Seeing those small windows into her new world brought a strange mix of emotions: guilt, sadness, and an unsettling sense of finality. I had thought that cutting her out of my life would be the end of it, but the truth was, even though I didn't see her or talk to her, she was still there, like a ghost haunting the corners of my mind. And I couldn't escape her, just as I couldn't escape the consequences of what I had done. One night, about a year after everything had fallen apart, I found myself sitting at home, staring at the ceiling. The house was dark. The only light coming from the soft glow of my phone on the coffee table. I had been avoiding it, knowing that nothing good ever came from diving back into the past, but something pulled me toward it. Curiosity? Regret? I wasn't sure. I picked it up and opened the social media app I hadn't checked in months. As I scrolled mindlessly through photos and posts from people I barely knew, I stumbled upon a familiar face, Kelly. She had been tagged in a picture, smiling, surrounded by a small group of friends. She looked different now, her hair a bit shorter, her face a little more tired, but there was something else too. She looked lighter, like someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for a long time and had finally set it down. Seeing her like that, happy, or at least pretending to be happy, did something to me. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but it hit me hard, harder than I expected. I realized that while Kelly had moved on, or was trying to, I was still stuck in the same place I had been when I destroyed her life. I hadn't moved forward. I hadn't grown. I had simply existed in the wreckage. I set the phone down and rubbed my face, trying to push away the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. The weight of my choices, the revenge, the bitterness, the hatred, was finally catching up to me. And for the first time, I couldn't ignore it. The revenge that I had once seen as my salvation had become my prison. I had spent so much time focusing on destroying Kelly that I had forgotten to rebuild myself. And now, as I sat in the quiet darkness of my home, I realized that I had nothing left. No career ambitions, no friends, no love, just a gaping void where my life used to be. I tried to remember what it had felt like before Kelly's betrayal, before the affair, before the revenge. Had I been happy? Truly happy? Or had I just been content, coasting through life without ever really examining what I wanted or needed? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been lost long before Kelly's affair. Her betrayal had only been the catalyst, the match that had lit the fire of everything I had been avoiding. I stood up and walked through the house, looking at the remnants of the life we had once shared. There were still traces of her everywhere. The framed photos that I hadn't had the heart to take down, the souvenirs from trips we had taken together, the little pieces of her that had woven their way into the fabric of my life. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel anger when I looked at them. I felt something else, regret. Not just for what I had done to her, but for what I had done to myself. I had let my anger consume me, let it dictate my every move, until there was nothing left but ashes. And now, a year later, I was finally beginning to see the cost of that anger. I needed to let it go. The realization was a quiet one, but it hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo what I had done, couldn't erase the pain I had caused. But I could choose to move forward. I could choose to stop letting revenge define me, stop letting it be the lens through which I saw the world. The next morning, I woke up early, earlier than I had in months. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow through the windows. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the photo of Kelly and me that still hung on the wall. We were smiling in the picture, carefree, happy. I hadn't looked at it in so long, but now, as I gazed at it, I felt a sense of peace. I took the photo down, placed it gently in a drawer, and closed it. It was time to start over. A few months passed after that quiet morning of self-realization. Life didn't change overnight, but there was a shift. It was subtle, like the first signs of spring after a long, brutal winter. I found myself focusing more on work, putting in genuine effort instead of just going through the motions. I even reconnected with a few old friends, slowly repairing the bridges I had let burn in the fallout of my revenge. But most importantly, I had let go of the anger. It wasn't an easy process, and there were still days when the bitterness threatened to creep back in, days when I thought about what could have been if things had gone differently. But for the most part, I had made peace with it all, or at least, I was trying to. Then one evening, as I was grabbing a quick dinner at a quiet cafe downtown, I saw her again. Kelly. She was sitting at a small table by the window, alone, a book open in front of her and a coffee cup in hand. She looked more relaxed than the last time I'd seen her, less burdened, and for a moment I considered leaving. Part of me didn't want to disrupt the fragile peace we had both worked so hard to find. But then she looked up, and our eyes met. There was a brief flicker of recognition in her gaze, followed by a small, hesitant smile. It wasn't the kind of smile you give someone you're happy to see, but more the kind that says, "We've been through too much not to acknowledge each other." I wasn't sure what to do. My instinct was to walk away, to keep the distance that had allowed us both to heal. But something inside me pushed me forward. Maybe it was the fact that this time felt different. There was no anger left, no need for closure or revenge. Just two people who had once shared a life, now trying to move past the wreckage. I approached her table slowly, unsure if I was making the right decision. She didn't look away, though. If anything, she seemed curious, as if she too was wondering what would come next. "Hi," I said awkwardly, standing by her table. "Hi," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "Do you want to sit?" I hesitated for only a moment before pulling out the chair across from her. As I sat down, a wave of familiarity washed over me. This wasn't the first time we had shared a quiet moment like this, but it felt completely different. The tension that had once existed between us was gone, replaced by something lighter, something neither of us knew quite how to define. "How have you been?" I asked, knowing it was a loaded question. She gave me a small smile, one tinged with a hint of sadness. Better, she said. I'm getting there, one day at a time. I know what you mean, I replied. And I did. The past year had been a series of small steps, each one a little easier than the last, but it was still a process. Healing wasn't linear, and I knew that better than anyone. We sat in silence for a while after that, both of us sipping our drinks and occasionally glancing out the window at the busy street outside. It was strange, sitting there with her after everything that had happened, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like the silence was exactly what we needed. I've been thinking a lot, Kelly said after a while, breaking the quiet. About us, about everything that happened. I looked at her, unsure of where she was going with this, but I stayed silent, letting her continue. I've made peace with it, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. What I did? It was wrong. I know that. I betrayed you, and I can never take that back. But I've spent so much time beating myself up over it, and I realized that if I'm ever going to move forward, I need to forgive myself. I nodded slowly, understanding more than I wanted to admit. It's hard, I said quietly. Forgiveness, I mean, especially when it's yourself you have to forgive. She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine for a moment before she spoke again. What about you? She asked. Have you forgiven me? I paused, considering her question carefully. A year ago, the answer would have been a resounding no. But now, after everything, things had changed. I had changed. I think I have, I said, surprising myself with how true the words felt. I mean, I won't lie. It hurt. A lot. But holding on to that pain, it wasn't doing me any good. And I realized that if I kept holding on to it, I'd never be able to move on. Kelly looked relieved, though a bit surprised, as if she hadn't expected me to be so honest. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You don't know how much that means to me. We sat there, both of us absorbing the weight of that moment. It felt like the end of something that had been hanging over us for far too long. And in its place was something lighter, something closer to acceptance. So, I said, clearing my throat and trying to lighten the mood. What are you reading? Kelly glanced down at the book in front of her, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Oh, it's nothing special, just something to pass the time. I smiled, grateful for the shift in conversation. We talked for a while after that, about books, movies, even old memories. It was strange how easy it was to slip back into casual conversation with her, despite everything we had been through. But this time, it was different. There were no expectations, no hidden agendas, just two people reconnecting in a way that felt right. As the evening wore on, we said our goodbyes, neither of us making any promises to stay in touch. We didn't need to. We had found our closure in that cafe, in the quiet exchange of words and shared memories. And that was enough. As I walked home that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I didn't feel the weight of regret or anger pressing down on me. I had made peace with the past, and in doing so, I had made peace with myself. In the weeks that followed my chance meeting with Kelly, something in me shifted. It wasn't dramatic, like a lightning strike of revelation, but more like the slow thaw of a long winter. Forgiving her, and more importantly, forgiving myself, had loosened the grip of the past. I no longer felt weighed down by the bitterness I had carried for so long. For the first time in what felt like years, I could breathe freely. I found myself thinking about Kelly less often. When she did cross my mind, it wasn't with the sharp pang of anger or regret that used to accompany her memory. It was quieter now, softer, like a distant echo. I realized that the hold she had on me had faded, replaced by a calm acceptance of what had happened and what couldn't be undone. But with that newfound sense of peace came the undeniable fact that my life had been fundamentally altered. The choices I had made, the revenge, the isolation, the bitterness, had left scars. And while forgiveness had brought a measure of healing, it couldn't erase everything. I still had to deal with the consequences of my actions. One of the biggest consequences was the loneliness. I had pushed so many people away during my downward spiral, convinced that no one could understand the depth of my pain. In doing so, I had created a chasm between myself and the world. Now, as I stood on the other side, I realized just how far I had distanced myself from the people who had once cared about me. I decided it was time to reach out. The first person I contacted was David, my closest friend from work before everything fell apart. He had tried to support me during the worst of it, but I had shut him out, too consumed by my anger to let him in. I wasn't sure how he would respond to my sudden attempt to reconnect, but I knew I had to try. I sent him a simple message. Hey, it's been a while. I know I haven't been the best friend lately, but I was wondering if you'd want to grab a drink sometime. I'd love to catch up. It took a few hours for him to respond, and during that time, I felt the familiar anxiety creeping in. What if he wasn't interested? What if he had moved on, just like everyone else? But then his reply came through. Sure, man. Let's do it. Been wondering how you've been. Relief washed over me as I read his message. It was a small step, but it felt significant. I had spent so long shutting people out that I had almost forgotten what it was like to be vulnerable, to admit that I needed others in my life. David and I met up the following week at a bar we used to frequent after work. The conversation started awkwardly at first, both of us skirting around the obvious topic, what had happened to me and why I had disappeared. But after a couple of beers, the tension eased, and soon we were talking like we used to. You went off the grid, man, David said, his tone light but his eyes serious. I was worried about you. I know, I admitted. I wasn't in a good place. He nodded, taking a sip of his drink. Yeah, I could tell. We all could, but we didn't know how to help. And then, after everything with Kelly, well, you just shut us all out. I'm sorry, I said, my voice sincere. I pushed everyone away when I should have leaned on you. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I couldn't. David leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment. You're here now, he said finally. That's what matters. It wasn't an absolution, but it was enough. We talked for hours that night, catching up on everything that had happened since I had withdrawn from the world. By the time we parted ways, I felt lighter, like a piece of myself had been restored. After reconnecting with David, I began reaching out to other people I had lost touch with, old friends, colleagues, even family members I had been distant from. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy. Some people were more willing to forgive than others, and I had to accept that not everyone would welcome me back with open arms. But that was okay. The important thing was that I was trying and that I was no longer hiding behind the walls I had built around myself. One afternoon, while scrolling through my phone, I came across an old contact, Jessica. She had been a close friend of both Kelly and me before everything had fallen apart, and she had cut ties with both of us after the scandal broke. I hadn't thought about her in a long time, but now, seeing her name, I wondered if it was time to reach out. I hesitated for a moment, then typed a message. Hey Jess, it's been a while. I know things got messy back then, but I'd love to catch up if you're open to it. I didn't expect a response, but a few hours later, my phone buzzed. Wow, hey, I wasn't expecting to hear from you, but yeah, let's meet up. We met at a small cafe downtown, a neutral place where the weight of our shared history wouldn't feel so heavy. When I walked in and saw her sitting at a table near the window, I felt a wave of nostalgia. Jessica had been like a sister to me at one point, always the one to offer a listening ear or a well-timed joke when things got tough. But when everything with Kelly blew up, she had disappeared from my life without a word. She looked up when I approached, offering me a small, tentative smile. Hey, she said, her voice soft but warm. Hey, I replied, sitting down across from her. Thanks for meeting me. Of course, she said, though there was a slight edge of hesitation in her tone. I wasn't sure what to expect. I nodded, understanding her uncertainty. I don't blame you. Things got complicated. She raised an eyebrow. Complicated is one word for it. I let out a small laugh, more out of nervousness than anything. Yeah, I guess that's putting it mildly. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us trying to find our footing in this new, uncharted territory. Finally, Jessica spoke. So, how are you? She asked, her tone genuine. Really? I thought about the question for a moment, then answered honestly. I'm better. Not perfect, but better. It's taken me a while, but I've started to make peace with everything. Jessica nodded, her expression softening. I'm glad to hear that. I was worried about you, about both of you, honestly. Kelly? I asked, surprised that she had mentioned her. Yeah, Jessica said, glancing down at her cup. We don't talk much anymore, but I know she's been trying to move on too. I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me had always wondered how Kelly had been coping, but I had deliberately avoided finding out. Now, hearing it from Jessica, it felt strange, like peeking into a life that I no longer had any right to be part of. I think we've both been trying, I said finally, in our own ways. Jessica looked at me for a long moment, then smiled softly. It's good to see you again. It's good to see you too. And just like that, another piece of the past began to heal. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There were no grand revelations, no moments of instant clarity. Instead, it was a series of small decisions, day by day, as I pieced together the fragments of the person I once was, alongside the new understanding of who I had become. I had started going to therapy, something I had long resisted. It wasn't easy at first, talking about my feelings, my mistakes, and especially the damage I had done, both to myself and others, was uncomfortable. But it was also necessary. In those sessions, I began to unravel the knot of anger and regret that had been tangled inside me for so long. I came to terms with the fact that my quest for revenge hadn't just been about Kelly's betrayal. It had been about the deep-seated insecurities I'd harbored for years, the unspoken fear of not being enough, not being loved. The more I worked through those emotions, the more I realized how much of my pain had been self-inflicted. Yes, Kelly's affair had shattered me, but I had chosen how to respond. I had chosen revenge over healing, bitterness over forgiveness. And in the process, I had lost more than just my marriage. I had lost myself. But I was finally learning how to forgive, not just Kelly, but also me. One day, after a particularly intense therapy session, I decided to take a walk. It was spring, the air fresh and filled with the scent of blooming flowers. I wandered through the park, watching people laugh, jog, and play with their kids. Life moved on, and so did the world, even when we felt stuck. It was a simple truth, but one that I had resisted for so long. I found a bench and sat down, letting the sounds of the park wash over me. As I sat there, reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't haunted by the past. Kelly's betrayal, my revenge, it all seemed like another lifetime, a different person's story. It wasn't that I had forgotten what had happened, but rather, it no longer defined me. I had allowed it to shape me for so long, but now, I could finally let it go. It was then that my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, surprised to see a message from Kelly. Hey, I know this is out of the blue, but I wanted to thank you for what you said that night at the cafe. It helped me more than you know. I hope you're doing well. I stared at the message for a long time, a swirl of emotions rising within me. I hadn't heard from Kelly since that evening we met by chance, and honestly, I hadn't expected to. We had both said our goodbyes in our own way, and I thought that was the end of it. But as I read her message, I realized that this was another step in the journey of healing for both of us. She was thanking me, but what she didn't know was that I owed her thanks too. Without her betrayal, as painful as it had been, I wouldn't have been forced to confront the parts of myself I had buried for so long. I typed a response, my fingers lingering on the screen as I thought carefully about my words. Thank you, Kelly. I'm glad we both found some peace. Take care. It was a simple message, but it felt right. I didn't need to say more, and neither did she. We had both moved on, and though our paths had crossed in ways neither of us could have predicted, we had emerged on the other side, different but stronger. As I put my phone away, I realized that this moment was the closure I hadn't known I was waiting for. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a tearful apology, but the quiet acknowledgement that we had both survived and that life would go on. In the weeks that followed, I continued to focus on myself, on building the life I wanted, not the one I thought I deserved. I reconnected with friends, deepened my relationships, and even started dating again. It wasn't easy at first, opening myself up to the possibility of love after everything that had happened. But I knew I was ready. I had learned the hard way that love, real love, couldn't be built on fear or insecurity. It had to come from a place of trust, vulnerability, and forgiveness, something I was only just beginning to understand. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. It had been a long, painful road, filled with mistakes and regrets. But it had also been a road of growth, of self-discovery, and ultimately of healing. I wasn't the man I had been when Kelly and I first fell in love. I wasn't even the man I had been when everything fell apart. I was someone new, someone who had learned the price of revenge and the power of forgiveness. And as I watched the sky darken, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. The lesson I had learned, the one that had taken me so long to understand, was simple but profound. Forgiveness wasn't about letting someone else off the hook. It wasn't about pretending the pain didn't exist. It was about freeing yourself from the prison of anger, the weight of resentment, and the chains of the past. It was about letting go, not for them, but for you. And finally, after all this time, I had learned how to let go.